I have a strange history with it because I worked on it, and even at the time, and I was, I said this to Jim uh, very presumptuously at he's the director and I'm just a sprog, I did ask him why the Gelflings couldn't be children in makeup because that would give you scale.
Hmm.
And Jim said, as was his entire right, that he wanted the film to be an all puppet film. I think that film would have, if they, this is just my opinion, but
Sure.
if the Gelflings had been human, I think that film would have a different
Mm.
effect. I think it would have a different place in film history.
How are things? It's been a while.
Things are good. Just wrapping up shooting the last episode of the second season of the TV show I'm working on for Nickelodeon right now, which is called Max and the Midnights. And the first episode, I think, drops at the end of October. So in about a month's time. And we're just finishing up the end of season 2 right now.
That's awesome. That's really good to hear that you're working on something special and looking forward
Yeah,
to checking that out whenever that comes out and end of October.
I think it is special. I think it's I think it's a really good show. I mean, it's got great scripts and it's right in my wheelhouse. It's sort of monsters and a quest and big silly comedy. But we're making it in a really interesting way, so that the cinematography will be, I think, a lot more sophisticated
Mm.
and cinematic than most TV shows, kids' TV shows certainly, because we use Unreal. And I'll be very curious to see what people think of it. I mean, I've had a blast working on it. I think it's a great show. We have a great team, and it's been fun. And I think it looks spectacular. We shoot in 2:3:9, so we shoot in scope, although we change the aspect ratio. But it does look very cinematic. We've got very sophisticated lighting. I don't know. You never know. You think you've done something really good, and people look at it and go, "Yeah." So I hope people like it. I know we're all proud of it, and it's probably like one of maybe only can only think of two productions I've worked on where you get really lucky. You get the really good project, and the people you're making it with are are great, and you love your crew and you love the people in charge and you love the project. That I've been doing this for like 50 years. I've only had that happen like twice. Kung Fu Panda was one, and this is the other. Normally, you get a kind of a meh kind of a project, but you love your crew, so you
Mm.
have fun working on the thing, but the thing itself is not that great. Um, in my career, I would put a lot of things, but the project that brought me to America, which was to do the animated Saturday morning show of Back to the Future. Um, I would describe that. The show itself, you know, is a Saturday morning show. We try to make it better, but at the end of the day, that's what it is. But the crew of people that I met in San Francisco, still some of my very best friends. I've met in my life, and I had a great time. You know, making that show, even though the show itself was kind of like, meh, just one of those things. But the experience was great. So usually it's that, and very, very rarely you get everything. You get the show that you think, movie, TV show that you think is is really good and a great bunch of people to work with. And if you get a few of those in your life, you're very lucky.
That's amazing. It's really nice to hear the authenticity in your conversation about how in 50 years you've done all these projects and only two of them where you felt that it was a good project, the crew was good, and Kung Fu Panda being one and this being the other. But speaking of, your career, and you talked about Back to the future. Um, no better segue than to kind of go into your beginnings, which is I think you worked on the Dark Crystal, Jim Henson and Frank Oz's film,
Yeah.
as well
No,
as Labyrinth. I'll give
yeah,
you a little bit of context about both of my. Sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
Sorry, no, I beg your pardon, Gerard. You go.
No, no, no. Please tell me if I've mistakenly
No, nothing,
said
no
something that
mistake.
I need to be corrected at.
No mistake. I worked on both of those, but I started on the Muppet Show. I went to Dark Crystal from having
Okay.
worked on the Muppet Show, and then from the Muppet Show, I worked. The first feature film I worked on was the Great Muppet Caper, and then from the
Mm,
Great Muppet Caper, I got to work on the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and then Little Shop of Horrors with Frank Oz.
awesome. So my little, history with Jim Henson growing up with the shows that I grew up with was Fraggle Rock, right? Like the original, not the remake though, that's on Apple TV, the original one. And Labyrinth, I never saw Dark Crystal as a kid. Never did. I did see Labyrinth in 1988, 89, I would like to guess. And I was 11, 12 years old, and it had such an impact that I've seen that movie so many times. I mean, the scenes, and it reminded me even at the time of Wizard of Oz, which I had seen recently, just because, there's a quest, you stumble into three different characters who are different, and you get to where you want to go with your destiny. With Dorothy, she wants to go home. With Labyrinth, she wants to find her brother and go home. And Labyrinth is one of the most special movies I think it's ever made. I don't know if it's considered to be a classic by a lot of people, even though it is. I feel not many people talk about it. I just feel it's very underrated, at least from my perception when I talk to people, because nobody talks about it. Like people talk about Star Wars, people talk about Willow, nobody talks about Labyrinth. Before we get down to, Dark Crystal, just tell me about your work on Labyrinth. What were you involved in from day to day and your experience working on it with Jim Henson?
Well, my experience on Labyrinth was probably less than my experience on Dark Crystal. Um, I'd left full time employment with the Muppets. Sort of, I've been with them for like I don't know 5 years, I think, starting in '77. So I think I'd left. But what would happen? Once if you were sort of in Jim Henson's sort of sphere and he liked you and he liked what you did, even if you left, you got reeled back in. So every now and again, and I could always weirdly I could always tell when I was going to get a call from Jim. I would just get a tingling in my spidey senses that and it might be months, but I'd suddenly get a sense, oh, Jim's going to call, and he would within like an hour. I get a call, or maybe the next day, but it would be from that feeling. It always I would get a there would be some kind of thing from Jim, and he would be on the phone, and he'd be like, oh, I've got an idea, and I'd like you to maybe help me out working on it. And that was kind of what it was with Labyrinth. He wanted me to come in and um, take the three main puppet characters, Hoggle, Sididimus, and Ludo, who had been designed by Brian Froud. Brian Froud again was the conceptual designer, as he had been for the Dark, excuse me, the Dark Crystal. So I wasn't coming up with any designs for Labyrinth. What I was being asked to do by Jim was to take Brian's designs and do kind of rotations of the characters and expression charts and lip sync and things like that, so that the sculptors and the puppet builders would know, A, would have more information, because Brian would do a beautiful design, but it would be like a watercolor painting or some sketches, and the essence of the character would be totally captured and be there. but the sculptors and the builders needed to know what happens when that thing got turned around, what it looked like from the back, or from three quarters, or for the animatronic mechanism builders, they needed to know how many facial controls they needed to build in. So what were the extreme expressions that this character was capable of? Those things were not in Brian's painting. His painting would define the character. But Jim wanted me to, take Hoggle and run him through a gamut of extreme expressions, because he was probably the most extreme character, and actually was the most critical to the plot. So I did turnarounds to help with the sculpting, and then I just did pages and pages of different expressions, including really far out ones that I knew would probably be too much, just to see where the breaking point is. Okay, that's got too grotesque. And then they became a guide between Brian's paintings and sketches, and his he was the overall control and kind of quality control for the representations of his creatures. But my things were also to help the sculptors and the modelers, and the builders with information they didn't have from Brian's paintings and sketches. So that's what I came in, and I also did some kind of like production drawings, and I sent all this. I found them like a year or so ago, and I sent them all off to the Henson archive. I found original drawings from Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and the Muppet Show, and so they now reside in the Henson archive. But I did some sort of like conceptual sketches of things that were in the script, that were indicated in the script, just to sort of give Jim an idea of, this kind of thing. Is that what you were thinking? Is that how you'd see it? So it was a sort of mix of those things, but it wasn't a very long gig. I wasn't there for shooting. Once Jim was happy that I'd sort of nailed the turnarounds. Since Sidinimus I did, because he was going to be seen as full. Ludo was a giant costume, so he was easier. Sidinimus was a small character, so he was mostly a hand puppet. But I think for some long shots, I can't remember if he was marionetted or sometimes he was seen as a full-length puppet with an operator working. So there was some sort of drawings I had to figure out about how to transition from the hand puppet to the full length to, he would ride on, there was a big sort of sheepdog he would ride on and things like that. So it was a lot of that kind of stuff, but it was I don't know, I can't remember exactly how many weeks or months it was, but it was a short gig. It wasn't certainly for the duration of the film, and up until Jim's death, this would be the kind of thing I get a call a few times a year for him, where he'd want me to come in and work with him on something, helping him develop it, and that was great.
You mentioned Didymus. The great thing about that character is, even I remember when I was watching it as a kid, you knew it was a puppet, and that's what makes it more interesting, because the personality Didymus had and the character Didymus had, it wouldn't have worked in any other way, in my view, because of his, this persona that he presented. And you imitated Jim Henson. I've
Very
never met the
badly.
guy. Sorry?
Very badly.
But it's funny because I've never met the guy. I just at Toronto International Film Festival, Saturday night premiered, which is like 90 minutes leading up to the Saturday Night Live first episode. It's by Jason Reitman, and Jim Henson is a character in the film.
Oh, because of Land of Gorch.
Yeah.
Which
So
I think
when
that
you
was early try. In a sense, you could, in the Land of Gorch, which wasn't successful and didn't last very many episodes on Saturday Night Live, but those are the very first seeds of Dark Crystal. That was Jim experimenting with different kind of puppets that were kind of not fuzzy and goofy Sesame Street or Muppet characters, that were kind of slightly more monstery and dark and creepy, which Jim definitely liked. You know, Jim liked that stuff, and I think that those Land of Gorch characters, you know, were the very first building blocks that led to Dark Crystal and Labyrinth.
And yeah, and he doesn't have a lot of, scenes. I think he has like two or three small scenes, and he seems confused and lost, and he talks in a very like, low voice, not confident enough. And when you when you were imitating him or trying to, it just reminded me of those scenes from Saturday Night. And Jim Henson's, I saw Dark Crystal recently, and I saw it again this morning just before we started chatting. I personally, for me, when I was watching the Dark Crystal, I didn't like it as much as Labyrinth. However,
Mm.
if I put myself in that time period in early 1980s, to have something like that come out at that time, 45 years ago, and it was like 4 years after Star Wars, is mind-boggling that if they were to do something like that today, they'll probably make it completely CGI.
Yeah,
Right? And it's just amazing the amount of character in those, puppetry went into, despite the fact that the film, I personally didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Labyrinth, but there was just so much technicality and so much hard work and so much character in those in that film.
yeah, no, it it's absolutely a film that, you know, is unrepeatable. No one, you know, even if when they did the sequel for Netflix,
Mm,
you know, they were using a lot of puppets, but there's a lot of CG stuff in there. You know, and when they did Dark Crystal, there was puppets out on location up in, and even at the time, and I was, I said this to Jim uh, very presumptuously at my, he's the director and I'm just a sprog. I did ask him why the Gelflings couldn't be children in makeup because that would give you scale.
hmm
And Jim said, as was his entire right, that he wanted the film to be an all puppet film. So he wanted everything to be a puppet. And that was the choice that was made. There are a couple of shots in there where they do use, either Kieran Shah, I think, is seen running very briefly in a wide shot, and there are, I think, there's a shot of the Gelflings on a river where they had to use children for the very wide. Went to the puppets for the close up. So there are a couple of quick cutaways to actual human beings. I think that film would have, if they, this is just this is just my opinion, but
Sure.
if the Gelflings had been human, I think that film would have a different
Mm,
effect. I think it would have a different place in film history. I think one of the things that was as much happening right there as possible, and uh, it was a strange time. It was it's 5 years after Star Wars when it was released, but it had been
yeah.
in. We were working on that thing for years. I mean, we were working. It was at least a year of research and development before they started shooting that I was sort of part of it, which happened in London in this big workshop in Hampstead. So when we were making Dark Crystal, it was probably actively making it. It was probably only a couple of years after Star Wars,
Mm,
and what you could actually do on movies, even with the success of Star Wars, the scope of Dark Crystal, a fully built world, basically everything in the world other than a few natural landscapes is a puppet or is a created environment. At that time, that's amazing. I mean, even Star Wars isn't doing that. So uh, you know, I it, I have a strange history with it because I worked on it. And even at the time, and I was I said this to Jim very very presumptuously at my, he's the director and I'm just a sprog, I did ask him why the Gelflings couldn't be children in makeup, because that would give you scale.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim said, as was his entire right, that he wanted the film to be an all puppet film. So he wanted everything to be a puppet. And that was the choice that was made. There are a couple of shots in there where they do use, either Kieran Shah, I think, is seen running very briefly in a wide shot, and I think there's a shot of the Gelflings on a river where they had to use children for the very wide. Went to the puppets for the close up. So there are a couple of quick cutaways to actual human beings. I think that film would have, if they, this is just my opinion, but if the
Sure.
if the Gelflings had been human, I think that film would have a different effect. I think it would have a different place in film history. I think one of the things that was crazy, because I sort of heard people, because I went to see it when it first came out in London, and some of those sets for Dark Crystal, particularly the Crystal Chamber at the end, which is like 3 stories tall.
Yeah.
And if a Gartham warrior, one of those giant bug kind of creatures, is like almost 7 feet tall. And so you can see, if you know the Gartham warriors are like 7 feet tall, you can see the scale of that set. It's absolutely huge. No one got that because they're all weird creatures. I heard people talking as we came out of the theater, like, "Oh, it's all done with models on a table," like people thought they didn't understand the scale of that film. They thought it was like Thunderbirds or one of those kind of puppet shows we had on English television.
Right.
And
I
the
remember that.
huge expense of building these full-scale sets, that completely missed them because they didn't have anything human to grab onto. If they'd seen a human being in that set with all these giant creatures, and they'd have gone, good grief, that's like a James Bond set. It's enormous. But because it was monsters and weird things that they'd never seen before, they assumed that everything was like a small puppet and they'd been shot on a model stage. So a lot of it, I think, just missed people about how technically complicated and how epic and huge it was, because they they didn't understand what they were looking at. And I still think that if the Gelflings had been human, that film would feel very different. And a human talking to a creature versus another creature talking to a creature, I think and actually this is proved weirdly. The I saw the stand-in kids who were dressed up as Gelflings when they were between uh, takes, would talk to the people who are in the mystics and creature outfits, and they were just very honest. They would be like, "Hey, why have you got such a big nose?" and things. And there was this kid talking to this weird creature. It was really magical. That kind of something, and the puppeteers would say in character too, and they would respond as their character to the kids. That interaction was really interesting. But then when you swap out and put a sort of rather stiff, because they were constrained by the size they had to be, basically, it had to. I think it was a very tight puppet because Jim had big hands to do Jen. But a stiff rubber puppet talking to a rubber monster is different to a child or a human that's got all these little micro expressions happening as they talk to this creature. So I understand I still love the Dark Crystal just for its ambition and and the fact that it exists at all. There's no reason in the world a film that weird and that complicated should have got made, and no one will ever make another film like that ever again. Even if they wanted to do something like, they wouldn't use that technology. No one's going to be building everything, the way that it was built for Dark Crystal.
Right.
So it's a unique artifact, and I do it, but it it doesn't have the emotional connection I think it should,
Yeah.
and I think it could have if the Gelflings had been human, either children or small actors, because then you really would have understood, the Skeksis are big and the Gartham are freaking huge, and that I think would have added a whole level of scale and scope, for an audience that they didn't understand when they watched it.
Yeah. I mean, aside from the scale and scope, I think maybe if you look at films like Willow, if you look at films like Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, I mean, Labyrinth, right? There's that human connection and then there's that relatability.
Yeah.
And that's why I probably didn't connect to it either. But again, in terms of a production, um, I could tell that a lot of effort and work
Oh,
went into that. It's not just even about the production, but the designing of the characters and then making sure that things don't fall apart or, all that stuff. Um,
well, Jim went about Dark Crystal in a sort of weird way, but a very Jim way, where he basically designed the world first, and then
mm,
the script came out of the world rather than the other way around. He he had this big period of research and development when he had Brian Froud brought in, and basically was funding, a year or more of playtime where Brian was designing creatures and things, and we were building stuff in. When I say we, I wasn't building anything. I'm not a puppet builder, but stuff was being built in the Hampstead workshop. So they were building, like, doing experiments on what the Skeksis could be like and what the Mystics could be like. They brought in a mime director, Jean-Pierre Amiel, I think, to try and teach the puppeteers how to do full body movement. Um, they were building these Gartham suits of armor, basically, and they were trying to understand. There was no animatronics industry. There wasn't like a whole bunch of people who understood how to do animatronics at that time. So people were being brought in from the theater. They had people, who'd worked on costumes for the Royal Opera House. They had toy designers who did remote control cars and knew how to do remote control. They had, all these sort of craftspeople really trying to figure out, how to do things which hadn't actually really been done before. This is still, the film I think released in '82, but the R&D was happening like years before, the filming. So I think, we haven't got The Thing yet. We haven't got American Werewolf in London yet. We've maybe just had Alien, which,
yeah.
interestingly, I don't know if anybody knows this, but Jim told me this. He was approached to do the creature for Alien,
That
and he
makes
was also
sense.
approached to do the aliens in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I was a huge, big special effects, nut, and I was like, why didn't you say yes? Why didn't you do that? And the Close Encounters, I think Jim, very honestly, he said, I'm not quite sure we could have pulled it off. He was
Mm,
worried that at the time that Spielberg asked him, that they might not have been able to do, what was needed for the film. He didn't think that everybody had the necessary skill set yet. And then for Alien, he said he said I couldn't do it. I read the script, and I just thought that won't fit with our, kind of image,
Right.
and he said there were things in the script which got taken out in the final film, which he said I couldn't have done. I mean, it would have been bad for us as a company if we'd have done that creature. Even if we could have
Yeah.
done it, but there were some
Oh,
things
it's
in
the
there.
family brand,
Yeah,
right?
but but Jim liked weird, dark stuff. It wasn't that, and so he was trying, as I said, Muppets always, they began as late night. They were never kids stuff. They were sort of on late night TV talk shows originally, and they sort of migrated to Sesame Street, and then that kind of gave them a different image. But Jim he always liked dark, weird things. So he thought the Alien script was great, and I remember going to see Alien with Jim in London, and we went to see it at Odeon Leicester Square with I think a lot of the crew from either Muppet Show or Dark Crystal. It was a big outing. We like booked up a row of seats and I sat next to him as we and he thought it was a really amazing film. And again, I think he said to me that he said, I don't think we would have you know I don't think we would have made the Alien as good, but he wanted to, and that's why
Yeah.
Yoda was kind of a sort of test run for a different kind of puppet making that led into what they were going to do in Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. Yoda was sort of the first. Can we get a main character that's not Muppety, that can work in a big close up, on a 70-foot screen, and that was a
Right.
collaboration with Stuart Freeborn, makeup, senior, veteran makeup guy but a lot of the Wendy Meidner, Brian Froud's now wife, she was working with Stuart Freeborn on the fabrication of Yoda, and I went to see when they were shooting Yoda, that was really interesting. That was the first time I'd sort of seen a non-Muppet, puppet from the sort of Jim Henson organization in a very different kind of environment from the one I was used to from the Muppet Show and things. And I was like, oh yeah, that can work. That can really work, especially when he got Frank Oz performing.
Yeah, of course, of course. Um, it's funny you mentioned Frank Oz. He obviously co-directed um, Dark Crystal. Yeah, he did. And his voice is Yoda. But to me, like one of the we're kind of segueing here, but to me, one of my favorite Muppets. I think there was a relaunch of the Muppet Show in the early 90s, where they had Michelle Pfeiffer on one day, and the next day they had some other guest. For me, hands down, the best puppet Muppet ever is Miss Piggy. And Frank Oz, he has done remarkable with the voice,
Well,
and
it's not
he
it's not just
and
the
for him
voice.
to
He's the performer of those characters.
yeah,
He's
exactly,
doing the
yeah,
voice at the
yeah.
same time as he is performing Piggy or Yoda or any of his characters. So it's not voiceover work. He is the life in that
The puppeteer.
character, both vocally and in terms of its acting, physical acting, is all Frank. And Frank.
I knew about that about Miss Piggy. I didn't know that about Yoda.
No,
I
no,
didn't
no.
know that he was
Frank, Frank,
performing.
Frank was performing Yoda in Empire Strikes Back. Yoda's performance, every part of Yoda's performance is Frank, absolutely. And that's why Jim would always say Frank Oz is the best puppeteer in the world, and he
And
is.
he directed films too, like obviously Dark Crystal, and he also did the Return to Oz for Disney.
I don't think
Um,
I
uh,
don't think Frank did Return to Oz. I think,
sure.
yeah, I'm pretty certain that's not Frank. I think that was Walter Murch, who was genius.
You're right. You're
Sound,
right. You're right.
sound.
I don't know why I thought it was Frank Oz.
But Frank
I'm
went on a whole bunch of kind of good comedies, like Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, which is genius. So Frank kind of got away from sort of fantasy and puppets. He wanted to get into sort of straight live action, and was very successful with a lot of his films. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels is my favorite. But I worked on
I
Dark, Little Shop of Horrors with him, which is I think his first solo film, kind of a
mm,
transitional film, but it had a giant puppet as a central thing. But you could see in that film, apart from Audrey 2, the giant part, the plant, Frank is, flexing his directorial muscles, with the musical numbers and with the acting and the drama, and he sort of, I think in his future work, he really kind of left anything special effectsy or puppety behind because he just already done so much of that. And
yeah.
interestingly,
Go
you
on,
know,
go on.
well, I when I was on Dark Crystal, I know we're kind of jumping around between Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, but one of the
Uh-huh.
things that Jim asked me to do when I was working on Dark Crystal, they had they had a brilliant storyboard artist, a guy called Mike Plug, who came from comics, and he was like a brilliant, draftsman and a great comic artist. And he was going to do, the storyboards for Dark Crystal, the production boards. But Jim wanted me to do some pre-production storyboards, which I guess were ways of Jim just trying to explore scenes and work some things out before he got Mike to do the kind of the production boards for the film. And I mean, we did this really weird thing because Jim and Frank were co-directing. So I would get a week where I'd probably meet with Jim, I know, on the Monday, and he would give me a scene to work on to show him on Saturday, to show him, like, I don't know, midweek. So I get a couple of days. These were not elaborate. These were sort of, just a step beyond chicken scratch, really. But there were explorations.
Right.
Jim would tell me how he saw the scene, and then I would go and I'd get a few days to do my version of that scene, and then I'd show Jim the scene, and he would give me some notes, whatever. Then I do exactly the same scene for Frank, but they wouldn't talk to each other. So I do the Jim version for Jim, and then I do the exact same scene the Frank way, and then on Saturday we'd merge the two things. Saturday I'd come in to the workshop and we'd put up the Jim version and the Frank version, and they both look at each other's versions and they would sort of mix and match. Oh, I like that bit from yours. Oh, we could put that bit there. And then I do a Frankenstein of the two versions, and that would be a kind of a guide of how they were going to go about that scene that then Mike Plug would do the final much better drawn version of. And it was a very interesting experience because they had very different, not surprisingly, approaches, and I will say that I adore Jim, um, and and but I found that Frank's cinematic uh, vision was actually more interesting than Jim's. You know,
Mm,
Jim knew how to tell a story for sure in the air, but Frank would have the interesting, cinematic angles and way of approaching uh, the scene. Usually that Jim, had less of. Let's say it that way. Jim had a slightly more
yeah.
TV kind of approach to the scene. And Frank was sort of thinking of the most cinematic way, usually he's that's my memory anyway. This is going back a long time, and so it was very odd. You'd sort of sitting in a room with Jim hearing the scene, and then sitting in a room with Frank hearing what he wanted to do. Very educational, especially for me as I'm sort of, very raw and starting out. And then they would, as I said, merge them, and
Right.
it would then go on its sort of journey to evolve into whatever it became in the final movie. But that was, I don't know too many movies that have done that.
Yeah. No, that's interesting that you shared that. And I remembered after you corrected me on The Return of Oz being directed by Walter Murch, I was mixing that up with The Indian in the Cupboard, which was directed by
Oh
Frank
yeah,
Oz.
yeah.
Right.
Which
Which
I
was a
think is
great movie.
actually underrated
Yeah.
film. It's actually, I don't know why people really didn't like it at the time, and I think it's actually, a very good adaptation, and very sweet and good-hearted, and it has, I haven't seen it for some years, but visually I thought it was great. But people really
Yeah.
didn't seem to like it, and one of the reasons they didn't seem to like it was they didn't like the kid.
Oh, is that so?
That's what I heard. A lot of people just found the kid unappealing, and that kind of killed the movie for a lot of people, which I thought was rather unfair.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it was a good film. I haven't seen it ever since the mid 90s. I gotta watch it again. But Frank Oz, going back to him and then Jim Henson, what a great duo. And you talked about two separate versions. I've always wondered about this experiment. Like if you took a script, like let's say a 20-page script or even a feature script, and if there was a studio that had a budget to get three of the top directors in Hollywood, let's say Spielberg, Scorsese, Zemeckis, I'm just kind of tossing out names, or maybe even Clint Eastwood, and give them the scripts, go make your own movie. And how they would do it with different actors or same actors or overlap would be interesting experiment to see that not that whose film is better, it's just how different and what kind of personal elements do they bring to
It
the
would be,
table.
they would, each one would be absolutely, with the same material would come out absolutely differently. I guarantee it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's it is, it's such a personal thing. The things that
it is.
the things that sort of motivate you or inspire you, or that you want to see, different for everybody, and everything gets filtered through that. I mean, I'm doing it on my, on the shows that I'm doing for this show for Nickelodeon. I bring all my, obsessions and likes, and all those kind of things that I've had all my life and that I've used in other projects. They just, everything gets filtered through that. So when I'm approaching, you know a script, it's colored by all those experiences, and kind of, things I've retained over the years from films that I've loved, or things I've seen that I want to do my version of, or see if I can get a little bit of that to enhance the scene. And that's going to be true for every single director on the planet, and
Yeah.
that will mean that anybody could take the exact same script and shoot it in, a million completely unique and different ways,
Yeah.
for better or worse, but they would all be different. Just because it says,
100%.
man walks down the dark street, in the rain at midnight. There's 1,000 ways you can shoot that same thing. A big crane shot, a close up on his face, whatever. And I think that's what makes movies magical and wonderful. The fact that you can always be surprised by how someone has interpreted the material.
So true. Um, the Dark Crystal and the Labyrinth, when they came out, I mean, you kind of talked about Dark Crystal already, like what you thought. Even though your work on Labyrinth was not as intense or more as, Dark Crystal, when Labyrinth came out, Jennifer Connelly, who was beginning her career, David Bowie was already
He was
established.
he was huge.
What did you feel? Yeah. What were your feelings watching that film? As an audience member, also as a somebody who worked on it a little bit.
Honestly, my feeling about Labyrinth, yeah, again, there's a part which is just boggled by the imagination and the invention and the sheer bloody willpower to muscle a film of that complexity into life, which is
Mm,
true of anything that Jim did, whether it was it's Jim, we used to say, that Jim had a whim of iron. If Jim wanted to do something, it was going to get done. If he decided I want to make a weird fantasy movie, he would make that weird fantasy film somehow. If he wanted to make a puppet variety show, it was going to happen. Once he just said himself to this is going to happen, it would happen. It would just make it happen, and nobody quite ever figured out how he could do that. Especially when he made such big creative turns in his career. Like to jump from the Muppets at the height of their success to doing the Dark Crystal. Obviously, the height, the success of the Muppets, gives you some leeway to try and do things. But
sure.
to make a gigantic, expensive, all puppet fantasy film, I mean, that is a serious left turn. That however successful you've been with other things, people are going, why? Why not make another big Muppet movie? We'll give you lots of money to make another Muppet film. We get that, but a big weird fantasy. And Jim was like, no, I want to do that. And I want to do it this way. This is where it's going to be. And that was the way it was going to be. And that was the way it got made. So his ability to do that was, still unique. And I've never seen anybody, have that kind of quiet power that Jim did. He didn't do it, again, this didn't happen with lots of Sturm and Drang and shouting and drama. It was just, I want to do this. And then somehow he would just gather the forces of the universe and make that happen. But very quietly and benignly, inexorably, but gently. It was amazing. He was the quiet force. So I'm boggled that Labyrinth exists as well as Dark Crystal. I don't love Labyrinth, I have to say. I
Mm,
love bits of Labyrinth a lot. I find Labyrinth quite a hard film to watch from soup to nuts, as we would say. I like watching bits of Labyrinth. I get exhausted by Labyrinth. Partly it's very
fair enough.
dense, but it has that Alice in Wonderland problem for me, which is you go into a weird land and then this weird thing happens, 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 and then this weird thing. It's a little, there's not that much variety, or it's like there's an encounter with this strange creature, and then we go into this, land of farting bogs, and then we go, it's very episodic, and I think individual scenes in Labyrinth. This is just one, this is my personal opinion.
Yeah,
Individuals
yeah, of course.
are absolutely brilliant, but over the course of 80 minutes, I find it, I find it emotionally uninvolving, quite honestly. Or I haven't seen it in maybe 10 years. Maybe I've mellowed and I would feel differently. I definitely felt that at the time when I saw it. I was, boggled at the art direction and the technical finesse of the puppets, and the way it looked, and as I said, some of the individual set pieces. But overall, it didn't touch me. It didn't. I didn't really care, honestly. It felt in a way that Dark Crystal doesn't feel for me. Weirdly, Labyrinth feels very manufactured, and I
Interesting.
don't really know how to quantify it more than that.
Do you think it's kind of like now in the world that we live in today, where too much, excessive of CGI turns people off? Do you think it was the excessive of like the puppets and the sets and all that turned people off, or turned you off at least? Aside from the lack of emotion, human element that
Well,
you
I
didn't
think
see.
the primary thing is lack of emotion. I don't know. That's what a movie is. it should be a movie should be, it can be any emotion you like or a whole bunch of different emotions, but it, a movie is supposed to make you feel something, make you laugh, make you cry, both at once, be frightened, whatever,
Yep.
it, uh, that's what movies are supposed to do. So if you're not feeling anything, and I have to say, I really, other than wow, that looks cool and those puppets are great and the art direction is nice, but I really wasn't feeling anything particularly. Uh, I found it really didn't get to me. And I actually had more emotional involvement in Dark Crystal. Even though I had problems with Dark Crystal because of the Gelfling puppets. Sort of they're pretty inexpressive. The one of the things in the Dark Crystal that's kind of which kind of shows you the power of puppets in a weird way, like the podlings, which are very muppety. They're the most muppety, the sort of the potato people. They're the most muppety kind of creatures in Dark Crystal, and they're very unrealistic. They literally do. They got the wobbly hands from the Muppet Show, and they look very goofy, and their eyes are all offset, and they are much more appealing and much more empathetic than Jen and Kira, who are sort of living in that uncanny valley of not quite human enough to be human, and whereas the podlings, who are clearly a puppet, are funny and you empathize with them, and they're given more license because of their abstraction than you get when you try and be human. We all know what a human being looks. No one knows what a podling looks like, so you don't care if it's got wobbly arms and it doesn't move in a realistic way. And then that sort of lowering of your, sort of whatever resistance you have to it allows you to empathize with those
Yeah.
characters, which is why you empathize with puppets, and then you have emotion, you know. And I have more emotional involvement watching The Dark Crystal than I do watching Labyrinth. I find I'm watching Labyrinth on a very technical way, and being amazed by that, but I don't find myself ever sinking into the story. I always feel, the story is it's very episodic and it's very manufactured from one event to another event, and then a happy ending at the end. And I'm not carried along by it. I still love watching it from a technical way, and again celebrate it for the fact that it's unique and will not ever be repeated. But it doesn't get me in the feels, I have to say.
Yeah, that's okay. No, that's okay. I haven't seen it in a while, but I've seen it a few times. Once when I was 10, 11, and then a few times after that, maybe in the 90s and the early 2000s. Um, but having said all that, I feel that what Jim Henson has done for storytelling, there's only one Michael Jackson, there's only one Elvis Presley, there's only one Jim Henson. Um, and it's incredible the amount what he has done, not just for kids, but for adults. And recently there was a documentary that Ron Howard directed, which I have to
Yeah,
see. I don't. Have you ever had a chance to see it yet?
yeah. No, I watched it.
Okay.
It's very very nicely made. And it brought a lot of things back. For me, watching it. Yeah, the world doesn't throw up too many Walt Disneys or Jim Hensons. They happen very, very occasionally. There's a handful of people in the history of film that you could put into sort of roughly the same basket. I guess Disney, the most obvious, Jim Henson,
Yeah.
Ray Harryhausen, George Powell, Georges Méliès, Carol Zeman. There's a
David
small,
Lean.
yeah, you could make a small list of people who had a very unique vision and saw it through and made stuff that the world had never seen before, and and inspired lots of people because of that unique vision. And but it's a very small club. I don't know. I'm trying to think whether you get much above 10 names in that club of people who've made that kind of a contribution to the history of
Mm.
films, that have made things. I the reason I got into movies, wanted to get into films without ever understanding what that meant, was because I saw the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which is a Ray Harryhausen film, when I was like 8 years old, and I had no idea what I was looking at. It was monsters and Cyclops and a dragon and a skeleton and all this crazy stuff, and I didn't know what I was looking at. I just knew I want to do that without any understanding of stop motion photography, cinematography or direction. I didn't know what it was. It was just an experience that hit me so hard in my imagination that it just made me, just set me on some path of, I've got to find a way of getting into that business. And,
Yeah.
I think probably the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad maybe started more people on their, careers in movies than maybe any other film. I mean, I know Phil Tippett has said in documentaries that the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad was a seminal movie for him, and I think John Landis, and maybe Dennis Murray, and lots of people who went on to have
Yeah.
enormous careers. That was. But you could say the same thing about probably Disney and Jim Henson, and these people put something out into the world that just triggered something in certain people who were in the audience watching it, that affected them so deeply that they wanted to have a career of their own, kind of like that. And that doesn't happen very often. I mean, I don't know, how many movies today have that effect. I don't know that
Yeah,
that's
I
happening.
agree. I completely agree. I mean, Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. I probably saw it when I was 6, 7 years old, and I still remember that one. And then also Jack and the Giant Killer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That was I still remember that very vividly. But you're right. I feel, and maybe I don't know, maybe because we're maybe not in the same age group as younger people are, but I feel like after movies like Gladiator, Sixth Sense, and maybe a few handful of movies like, Transformers. I don't think there has been in any movie where people be like, or any director, maybe Christopher Nolan is one, maybe. Oh, I want to do this. Because, back in the 80s, there was Lucas, there was Spielberg, there was Ron Howard, I mean, there's dozens of names, Tony Scott, Ridley Scott, James Cameron, Michael Bay in the 90s. Yeah, you're right. I just don't, and I don't even feel inspired by watching movies. It's a very rare thing, like one in every few years that something will like have a hard impact on me. I just saw, sorry, go on.
Well, the one I saw this year, that I think if I'd seen it, maybe if I'd seen it, at a younger age, might have got me all fired up. And have you seen Love Lies Bleeding? Rose Glass. It's
No, I've not.
great. I just blew me out of my socks, that film. I love that movie. I mean, it's completely different from Seven Voyage of Sinbad, of course, but it's just, I found that film so invigorating and inspiring and exciting, and someone who was like, just doing really adventurous, interesting stuff all over the place, both in terms of the visual storytelling and the emotion and imagery. And I don't know, obviously, and that's just the film that I've liked the most this year. Your mileage may vary. So obviously it can happen, but I think the thing in the those kind of filmmakers from the 70s and the 80s that still have sort of huge cultural influence, that you could tell a Spielberg movie from somebody else's movie. You could tell a George Lucas film from somebody else's. You could tell a John Carpenter film from somebody else. They had, even though they were making kind of Hollywood product, if you like, they were making big entertainment. that was obviously designed to have mass appeal, there was a very individual voice. There's a big difference between a John Carpenter film and a Steven Spielberg film. Both are fantastic. I adored John Carpenter and adored Steven Spielberg, but you can just their filmmaking style is very different. Today, I couldn't tell, other than occasionally when you get someone like Rose Glass, other filmmakers who, but for Hollywood, a big Hollywood film, I don't know who made it. Could be anybody. They all look the same. They all feel the same.
Yeah.
And visually they're the same because they're all relying on CG so much. Other than Chris Nolan, who gets a special mention for tending to do
Practical
things for
effects.
real.
Yeah.
But there's just a generic way, a kind of committee-led way of making Hollywood films, that makes everything it's just stuff. It's just noise and color, and there's no excitement about seeing, and there was a real excitement about as a new John Carpenter film. I would be really, he's got a new film. I loved Assault on Precinct 13. I loved Halloween, The Fog. I've got to see The Fog. Sometimes you'd like it more than the other, but a John Carpenter film or a Spielberg film, a Brian De Palma film, they were meaningful. It was like that person's work is special and it speaks to me and I want to see that. I mean, I couldn't say I've got to go see, this superhero film or this action film because so-and-so's directing it. I won't know. It'll be completely generic. It'll be very professional and slick and everything, but it will have absolutely no personality of its own.
It has no voice. It has no voice.
No voice.
I have you ever seen History of Violence?
Yes, yeah, I love it.
Yeah, I saw that yesterday after a long time, and I had completely forgotten. I mean, what an amazing film by David Cronenberg. Like, it's just so, focused on a family, and that's it. That is it. And it carries through the emotion for 2 hours, and it hooks you on. It just doesn't let you go. It could have gone in so many different directions, but again, that whole style, that appeal that we were talking about, kept it grounded. And I hope to see movies like that now. But I think we talked about this last time when we spoke about Kung Fu Panda. I just keep going back to the older stuff more than I want to watch the new stuff.
I mean, it's funny you say that. We have so many streaming choices, these days, and more I find there's less I want to watch. There's an occasional thing like, I love Slow Horses on Apple TV, but I mean, there was that joke, like 300 channels and nothing on in cable, back in the days of cable, where you just scroll through the thing for like 45 minutes and end up not watching anything because you'd spent all your time just scrolling through stuff that you just didn't care about. I kind of feel that's the way it is with streaming.
It's the same. 100%.
A few little nuggets here and there, but most of the time I just look at this and it's just there's so much stuff and it's so generic and so ordinary and so uninteresting. I spend my time watching like 1940s film noirs right now. I would rather watch, even just an okay, not even one of the great ones, but an okay film noir from the 40s or early 50s is more interesting to me than watching whatever generic thing on Netflix or Amazon or whatever. I mean, I'm an old fart. Okay, so I get it.
That's okay. I relate to it, and I think, talking to you about Dark Crystal and Labyrinth has been very fascinating, and I appreciate your honesty and your straightforwardness. I'm really looking forward to your next project. I should be in LA next month for a couple of days. If you're free, we could grab a dinner. Yeah, it'd be nice to do that. But yeah, thank you so much, John, for your time, man.
Always fun.
Excited.
No. I don't know if your listeners got anything out of that, but it's always fun to talk to you, and we'd love to see if you come to LA, and we'll talk about anything else you want to talk about in the future.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Okay,
You take
bye-bye.
care. Thanks. Bye.